Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask our guests in-house to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones have been muted. As we prepare to begin, it's always appreciated. And for our internet viewers, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post the program later today on our website for everyone's future reference as well. Hosting our event today, as well as the panel, is Stephen Groves. Mr. Groves serves as the Bernard and Barbara Lomas Senior Research Fellow in our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Please join me in welcoming Steve Groves. Steve?
Thanks, John. It is my honor to welcome Senator Mike Lee back to Heritage. He's a frequent guest here, and we hope you keep coming as long as we have good topics for you to come and speak about. Senator Lee has, as everyone in the room knows, has been a champion of the Constitution and has defended it and the Senate's role in its preservation on countless occasions. I've actually had the opportunity to testify in front of Senator Lee on several occasions. At the Foreign Relations Committee on our favorite treaty like the Law of the Sea Treaty and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I've seen firsthand how he is guided by an adherence to the Constitution and respect for the treaty clause in Article 2 of the Constitution. Now, Senator Lee no longer serves on the Foreign Relations Committee, unfortunately for us who do a lot of work at the committee, but his interest in defending American sovereignty and protecting Senate prerogatives in the treaty process has not waned, which is what brings us here today. Because at the end of the month, there's going to be a 2-week conference that will take place in Paris to negotiate a new major environmental treaty on climate change. Now, if the negotiations go as the White House planned them to go, there will be no hearing at the Foreign Relations Committee, or any other committee for that matter. Because the president will not have any plans to submit this new climate change agreement to the Senate for its advice and consent. This is simple for one reason. It's because the president knows that there is insufficient support in the Senate for his climate change agenda. So he's simply going to label this new international agreement as an executive agreement instead of a treaty. Now, the White House intends thereby to bypass the Senate altogether on this Paris climate change agreement. So it would appear that the president is willing to make a climate change deal with 195 foreign countries, but is somehow not willing to make a deal with 100 senators here in the United States. So I look forward to hearing Senator Lee's comments on these recent developments, and I'm sure he has some strong views on these developments. So please join me in welcoming Senator Mike Lee.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's always great to be at the Heritage Foundation, where we can have a lengthy, in-depth discussion of issues that are important to our nation, with an eye always toward good process, good policy outcomes, and in particular with an eye toward compliance with the Constitution. Because we understand that the process that we use to adopt our legal system, the processes that we use to change policy, matter every bit as much as the ultimate outcome. It's part of what separates us from other countries, part of what it means to abide by the rule of law, is to operate under the governing structure that we've adopted. I'm honored to be here today to talk about the new climate change deal that President Obama is pursuing, along with the dangers that it poses to the American energy sector and to U.S. national sovereignty, and along with the opportunity to discuss what Congress can and should do about it. In a few weeks, Paris will host the latest round of climate change negotiations in what's called the Conference of Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, as most of you know, the objective of the UN Framework Convention is the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. It was negotiated, signed by President Bush, and ratified by the United States Senate back in 1992. Paris will be the 21st Conference of Parties in 23 years. That's a lot of conferences. But don't get the wrong idea. Being a UN climate negotiator is not some kind of a part-time gig. No, this is serious business. At least it's business that keeps a lot of people fairly busy. There's much more to the Framework Convention than the Conference of Parties. Each year, they host countless events, countless meetings across the globe. In 2015 alone, they've had meetings in over a dozen countries, including Switzerland, Thailand, and Chile. And yet the convention has precious little to show for its interminable meetings, except for perhaps what might be one of the world's largest freestanding collections of frequent flyer miles among those who attend these meetings. Most of the negotiations, at least those that don't lapse into some sort of stalemate, produce little more than a series of lofty aspirations, proclamations, and vague principles, and promises to come to an agreement at some later date. And so they don't resolve the issues right then. They just say, okay, we'll reconvene. We will resolve the issues that we've been discussing at some point in the future, and then they adjourn and get together again. But Paris, we're told, Paris will be different. This summer, the European Union's Commissioner for Climate Action said that there is no Plan B for Paris. Now, he confidently declared, quote, "These are not just ongoing UN discussions. Paris is final," close quote. It sounds very ominous. I don't know exactly what that means, what that portends for the future, but there is a preemptive sense of finality in his statements. Now, personally, I'm skeptical that this is the last we'll hear of UN climate talks. You think bureaucratic inertia is bad in Washington, and it is. But imagine if all of our dull federal buildings in this town were replaced with the exotic destinations of all these places that host UN climate negotiations. I think that produces its own type of gridlock. I think that produces its own type of inertia. But in at least one important respect, I think Paris will be final. It will be President Obama's last best hope to fulfill that infamously lofty aspiration that he announced in connection with his 2008 campaign for the White House. I'm not talking about his pledge to usher in, as he put it, the moment when the rise of the oceans begins to slow and our planet begins to heal. No one, not even President Obama, seriously thinks Paris will produce an agreement that could have any meaningful effect on global atmospheric conditions within the next 50 years. Because accomplishing that would require a universal agreement, obligating not just one country or a few countries, but all countries to make significant economy-wide emissions cuts of a fairly drastic sort. But for the nations whose economies increasingly depend on high-emission energy sources like coal, countries like India and like China, this is not a tolerable outcome. India's prime minister spoke for much of the developing world when he said, quote, "While the developed countries should have targets for emission cuts, developing countries should work on targets of encouragement," close quote. If the goal of Paris is to reduce the concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere, targets of encouragement simply won't cut it. It's not going to happen. But of course, that's not the goal of Paris, at least not for the Obama administration. No, for President Obama, Paris, above all, is an opportunity to continue his pursuit of that other lofty ambition from 2008, his goal of fundamentally transforming the United States of America. In particular, the president hopes to produce an agreement in Paris that will, at a minimum, fundamentally transform America's energy and transportation sectors. Earlier this year, several countries that will attend the Paris talks submitted to the Conference of Parties a document outlining the contributions they intend to make to the global climate change effort. The U.S. plan pledged to reduce domestic greenhouse gas emissions across the entire U.S. economy by 26 to 28% below 2005 emissions levels. This is, to say the least, to put it really mildly, an extremely ambitious target, and one that could not be achieved without very significant regulation, bringing about very significant changes to our economy. The regulations required to achieve it would, in fact, take decades to implement, and probably a host of new international monitoring and reporting mechanisms. They would also impose hundreds of billions of dollars in costs on the American economy. But the Obama administration's plan, to its credit, is not just ambitious, it's also deeply cynical, because at its core, the plan is an attempt to enshrine in an international agreement President Obama's unilateral environmental regulatory regime, which remains deeply unpopular with the American people, and with good reason. This is the same vision that prompted President Obama several years ago to say that under this plan, energy costs will necessarily skyrocket. Now, these energy costs aren't simply ethereal. They're not out there in the abstract. They're not somebody else's burden. These are energy costs that will be borne first and foremost by America's poor and middle class, who will feel it in a very real, very personal, very significant way in their own pocketbooks when those energy prices necessarily skyrocket. Now, this has been one of the president's longstanding goals, this kind of achievement. We often forget that no one expected President Obama's first signature legislative accomplishment to be Obamacare. It was, in fact, supposed to be an energy bill establishing a national limit on emissions, a strict set of limits. In the summer of 2009, President Obama hailed the cap-and-trade legislation that he was trying to move through Congress, calling it a bold and necessary step toward strictly regulating the U.S. energy sector. The bill was certainly bold, and I will give him that. So bold, in fact, that it was essentially laughed out of the Senate. It didn't get anywhere, and it was understood at the time that it would never get anywhere, not in that Congress, notwithstanding the fact that we had reached a sort of Democratic high water mark at that point. But was the legislation necessary to impose emissions requirements on energy producers? No, at least not according to President Obama and President Obama's Environmental Protection Agency. Shortly after the American people and their elected representatives refused to assent to a law that would have empowered unelected bureaucrats to micromanage energy producers, the EPA began reinterpreting old laws already on the books, to do precisely that. What they were unable to do through Congress, they would just go ahead and do through the administrative regulatory state. The flurry of unilateral administrative actions culminated in the president's Clean Power Plan, a stringent, costly, and unpopular set of EPA regulations that will undoubtedly face opposition of the courts and Congress and by future presidents. This is what we're facing. And it's precisely that kind of uncertainty, that sneaking suspicion that his transformation of America's environmental laws may not be permanent, that explains President Obama's strategy in Paris. When you look at the fine print of the U.S. contribution plan in connection with what's about to happen in Paris, you see that a significant proportion of the 26 to 28% emissions reductions are expected to come from existing regulations, especially from President Obama's Clean Power Plan. And now, with just 1 year left in office, he's apparently hoping that an endorsement from UN bureaucrats will give his regulators and the unprecedented expansion of executive power that they represent and that they necessarily require the credibility and the sanction that he was unable to secure when he moved his plan through the Congress, the credibility and the sanction that he was unable or unwilling to secure through the democratic process, through the normal legislative process ordained by the Constitution. But it's not just the American energy sector that could be fundamentally transformed if the president is able to produce the type of agreement that he wants to get in Paris. No, the unilateral process by which President Obama plans to commit the United States to a new climate agreement, a process designed explicitly to bypass the Senate and to avoid having to seek the Senate's advice and consent in connection with such an agreement, is another step in the fundamental transformation of the way we make international agreements. So in that respect, the impact of this will be felt beyond the energy sector and, in fact, beyond the scope of any plan that's developed in Paris. It'll be felt throughout our entire country insofar as it will affect every other international agreement, potentially, that may come into existence in the future. Pursuing a deal in Paris as an executive agreement instead of as a treaty would not only violate the plain meaning of the UN Convention, it would also defy the historical understanding of the constitutional limits that the president is subject to in connection with foreign affairs, limitations that exist to safeguard the sovereignty of the American people and their right to see to it that their government remains their government and is a government of, by, and for the people. In an excellent paper recently published by Heritage, Steve Groves, who we just heard from, examines what will likely be President Obama's strategy for avoiding Senate scrutiny of whatever deal is reached in Paris. And I highly recommend what he's written on this. It's very informative. In that paper, which again I couldn't recommend more highly, Steve pulls together media reports and statements from the White House to make a compelling case that the Obama administration will try to cobble together what they affectionately refer to as a hybrid agreement. A hybrid agreement. The hybrid is a word that everybody likes these days. I mean, people like their hybrid cars. There are lots of other hybrid things they like, and so it's a hybrid agreement. Modeled on the plan submitted by New Zealand, a hybrid agreement here would include a combination of legally binding procedural commitments and politically binding targets and timetables for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The theory is that so long as the emission reduction targets are only politically binding, the president would be under no obligation whatsoever to submit them to the Senate, under no obligation to present the agreement as a treaty to the Senate for ratification. Now, the hybrid agreement theory is a clever one, to be sure. But the problem is it flatly contradicts the understanding of the Framework Convention, which has been universally accepted since its ratification back in 1992. This distinction between either politically or legally binding emission reduction targets has never been a meaningful one in the history of this particular convention. Targets and timetables of any legal character have always been understood to require the Senate's advice and consent, such that they can't be put in place, they can't be deemed to be ratified, they can't be deemed legitimate in this country without Senate ratification. In fact, just to clarify the point, back in 1992, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee issued a report explaining the terms on which they offered their approval of the Framework Convention. And among those terms highlighted, one of those terms highlighted this notion of the Senate's rightful role in the future operation of this particular convention. The committee clarified that a decision by the Conference of the Parties or a decision by the executive branch to adopt targets and timetables, legally binding or not, would have to be submitted to the Senate for its advice and consent. Now, at the time, there was absolutely nothing controversial about these statements. There shouldn't be anything controversial about those statements today either. Particularly in light of our Constitution, there's no reason that they should be controversial. But they weren't controversial then. The George H.W. Bush administration accepted them without dispute because they reflected the long-standing view of the Senate's distinct and rightful role in the process of making international agreements. That role is expressed in the Treaty Clause of Article 2 of the Constitution. The Treaty Clause states, quote, "The President shall have the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur," close quote. Now, for a document that is premised on the strict separation of powers, the explicit joining of powers in the treaty clause stands out as somewhat unusual. It's a bit of an aberration. So for the most part, there is separation of powers within the Constitution, but in a few instances, there are powers that are shared, that overlap, and this is one of them. There's this area of overlap. But where there is overlap, that overlap and the terms of the overlap are defined by the Constitution itself. But as Alexander Hamilton explained in The Federalist, there is a peculiar propriety in sharing this particular power, the treaty power, between the Senate and the executive. For Hamilton, the treaty clause is, quote, one of the best digested and most unexceptionable parts of the Constitution, close quote, because it is consistent with the nature of treaties and the unique attributes of the presidency and of the Senate. Treaties are little more than contracts among foreign nations, according to Hamilton, and given the nature of international affairs, they're often needed to negotiate swiftly and covertly. Treaties carry the force of law, but unlike domestic laws, they derive their force from obligations of good faith between nations. Thanks to its unique capacity for secrecy and dispatch, the executive branch is best equipped to manage these negotiations with foreign nations. That's why the primary power resides in Article 2 with the President. But only legislative consent and the kind of deliberation uniquely available in the United States Senate can grant the broad political consensus necessary to ensure that the United States lives up to the terms of its agreement, the agreement that has been ratified. Hamilton's explanation of the treaty power laid the groundwork for the traditional American understanding of the factors that distinguish treaties and other types of international agreements. Those factors include whether it has the force of law or has the potential to influence domestic law, whether its terms extend over a long period of time, and whether it requires a high degree of trust and mutual obligation to be maintained under the terms of the agreement. According to this view, there's no doubt, and there can be no legitimate doubt, that an agreement of the size, the scope, and the duration contemplated by the Obama administration in Paris deserves to be submitted to the Senate for advice and consent for ratification. As recently as 2009, this was how everyone in Washington thought about the Senate's role in the process of making international climate change agreements. That year, ahead of the climate negotiations in Copenhagen, then Senator John Kerry said he and his colleagues were prepared to be, quote, deeply involved in crafting a solution that the world can agree to and that the Senate can ratify, close quote. Now, that was an important statement. It was uncontroversial at the time. It was relatively unremarkable at the time. It's important now for this reason. Why? Well, because today, this consensus appears quite tragically no longer to exist. When asked whether the president would seek congressional approval for a climate deal produced in Paris, White House spokesman Josh Earnest made the following statement. He said simply, "I think it's hard to take seriously some members of Congress who deny the fact that climate change exists, that they should have some opportunity to render judgment about a climate change agreement," close quote. That's actually what he said. Those are his words. In other words, he's saying, unless you share the White House view about climate change, both about the science behind it and about what we do about it, unless you share that view, you are going to be disqualified from having anything to say about it. Even if you're a United States senator, and notwithstanding the fact that the Constitution requires Senate ratification of an agreement like that, you are disqualified if you don't agree with the White House on that. That's a tragedy. And it also means that in the span of just 6 years, what was once respect has been turned into contempt in this very context. And it's not just contempt for Congress, which I know as well as anybody has done plenty to deserve any contempt directed at Congress. I mean, after all, we're an institution that now enjoys a public approval rating of about 9%, which makes us less popular than Fidel Castro in the United States. And it makes us only slightly more popular than the influenza virus, which inexplicably is gaining on us. It's contempt more fundamentally for the democratic process and for the American people that Congress represents. And this is what I find so troubling. In other words, it's one thing to hate Congress. It's another thing to denigrate the right of the people to be represented in that Congress, the right of the people who elect individuals to represent them in the House of Representatives and, for our purposes here, in the United States Senate, who will no longer have a voice in connection with an important matter of public policy like this one, which constitutionally is supposed to be submitted to the Senate for ratification. The chief obstacle to Obama's efforts to transform America has always been the sovereignty of the American people, the fundamental right of the people to consent to their laws by choosing those who make their laws. This is exactly why Congress did not send a cap-and-trade bill to the president's desk when he so badly wanted it back in 2010. And it's likely why Senator Kerry didn't claim in 2009 that the president had the authority to single-handedly commit the United States to a new climate agreement in Copenhagen. But today, with only 1 year remaining in office in the White House, and with the smug satisfaction of someone who believes the policy of climate change is just as settled as the science supposedly is, President Obama knows that compulsion, not persuasion, is the only way to fundamentally transform a nation, at least to fundamentally transform a nation in the way that he wants to transform it, with the speed that he wants to use in that transformational process. Now, in the few minutes I have left, I'd like to raise and offer a preliminary answer to the question that's probably on everyone's mind about now. What can possibly be done to stop President Obama from unilaterally committing the United States to a new climate agreement in Paris? Well, first, I think the House and Senate should take up and pass a joint resolution expressing unequivocally the sense of Congress that an agreement of the cost and scope and legal character contemplated by the Obama administration in Paris should be submitted to the Senate for advice and consent, for ratification. The purpose of this resolution would not be to oppose the president's plans on the merits of those plans, but simply to make explicit that which has been implicit in every other previous climate change negotiation, and that which is already required under the Constitution. This is simply a procedural step. For instance, in 1997, Senator Byrd, a Democrat, and Senator Hagel, a Republican, worked together to pass a bipartisan resolution to preempt a similar climate agreement that the Clinton administration was then negotiating in Kyoto. The unstated premise of their resolution was that the Kyoto Protocol would require the Senate's advice and consent in order to go into effect in the United States. That resolution passed by a vote of 95-0 in the Senate, with the support of many, like Secretary Kerry, who are in the middle of today's debate about Paris. This proved that it's not possible to to assemble a bipartisan coalition, not to debate the merits of the president's climate change policies, although that is, in fairness, a debate that we also need to have, but to assert the right of the American people to consent to their laws and to have the appropriate procedures followed when their laws are put in place. It's time we followed Byrd and Hagel's lead. Next, the Congress needs to wield what is perhaps its most important tool, its most powerful tool, the power of the purse. We can begin by making absolutely clear to the Obama administration and, just as importantly, to the foreign governments attending the Paris negotiations, that in America, it's the Congress and not the president acting alone that writes the checks. Members of both chambers and from both political parties have not only the authority, not only the right, but I believe the constitutional obligation to assert with one voice that Congress will not send a dime of taxpayer money to the implementation of any agreement to which the Senate has not provided its advice and consent. That goes for the billions of dollars that President Obama has pledged to send to the so-called Green Climate Fund. And it goes for any other funds that the Paris Agreement would expect the United States to give to developing countries for clean energy production. Finally, we need to start thinking more broadly, beyond the Paris talks and beyond January of 2017, when we are going to be swearing in a new president, about how we can repair the institutional damage wrought by President Obama's will-to-power approach to the presidency, and how to reform the laws and also the bad habits that have facilitated the accumulation of power in the executive. Now, in fairness, this accumulation of power has been going on for a long time. It's an accumulation of power that has occurred with both Republicans and with Democrats. But it's an accumulation of power that has found a lot of acceleration over the last 7 years and during this administration. For instance, we need to reform the Clean Air Act so that no future president can claim, as President Obama has tried to do, that a law passed in the 1970s somehow provides all the statutory authority and executive needs to impose new sweeping environmental regulations on the American economy for the rest of time. And we need to start thinking about how to address, in the long run, the profound imbalance between the executive and the Senate in the process of making international agreements, in the process of making international commitments that will bind the United States now and in the future. When the United States makes major binding international agreements, when it takes on significant commitments internationally, those agreements must always be subject to the advice and consent of the Senate. This is a basic principle that can't be restated and restated and restated over and over again enough. But we need to do more than that. We need to reapply that principle to our institutions and to our laws. We need to find new ways to reassert the prerogatives of the Senate and the process of making American commitments to foreign nations. In 2015 alone, we've seen two examples of how far the balance has tilted against the Senate: the Paris climate change negotiations and, of course, the Iran deal. Just a few months ago, in a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, I asked Secretary Kerry why the Obama administration decided not to seek the Senate's advice and consent in connection with the Iran deal. Why, Secretary Kerry, aren't you just submitting this to us as a treaty for ratification? He told me it was because the agreement involved multiple parties. This answer was not only wrong, it was not only wrong in the sense that it flatly contradicts the statement on the State Department's own website defining the word treaty as including something that includes multi-party international agreements. But it also revealed the extent to which the executive branch has stopped thinking seriously about its constitutional limitations and requirements, about checks that have been put in place on the power wielded by America's chief executive. What all these reform ideas have in common is that they're aimed at defending and asserting the ultimate sovereignty of the American people, which means that restraining an out-of-control executive is not a partisan effort. It's neither Republican nor Democratic. It's neither liberal nor conservative. This is simply an American ideal. This is a rule of law ideal. And it's not something that can be done by Congress alone. It will require the work of institutions like the Heritage Foundation to educate the American people about the dysfunction reigning in their nation's capital and what we, as citizens of this great country, can do about it. So I'm here to invite all of you not just to join me in this effort, but to lead it. To join me and others at the Heritage Foundation, others in Washington and across this great nation who are committed to the principle that we as a country are great, not because of who we are, but because of what we do. Part of what has inspired and motivated and made possible our greatness as a nation is our profound belief that bad things happen when you allow power to be concentrated excessively in the hands of the few. It's the whole reason why we have a limited constitution, why we have a constitution that carefully checks and balances power, is to prevent this very kind of thing from happening. we have to get back on track. We've got to restore those constitutional protections. As we do so, we as a country will benefit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks. We're going to begin the panel discussion portion of the program now. To go into some of the details that Senator Lee brought out in his remarks. I'm joined by three experts in this area that will bring different things to the table, different things to our discussion, to talk about, how we got to this point. I think Harlan Watson is going to focus on how we got to this point in history. And he's got some PowerPoint slides to give us some of this background. And then we'll go on to Christopher Horner, who's going to talk about what's going to happen in Paris and the interplay between the White House and the Congress and what can be done about some of the things that Senator Lee brought up. And then finally to my Heritage colleague, Nicholas Loris, who will talk about some of the domestic impact that will happen once this conference is over. Because as we heard from Senator Lee, the president intends to go over to Paris and make this international agreement, then come back to the United States, bypass Congress and the Senate, and instead implement those international commitments through burdensome domestic environmental regulations. And so Nick will touch on some of those items to talk about some of that domestic impact. But first we're going to hear from Harlan Watson, who retired a couple of years ago as a distinguished policy staff member from the State Department, but has a long career in being in the middle of international climate change negotiations. He has served as the U.S. Ambassador and Special Envoy to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and before that as the Senior Climate Negotiator, serving as an alternate head of the U.S. delegations to international conferences just like the one that will happen in Paris later this month. He previously served for more than 16 years on the House of Representatives Committee on Science, including as staff director of the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment. Harlan has a PhD in physics as well as a master's in economics from Georgetown. Interesting combination of degrees. Harlan, please feel free to start when you'd like.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, for the kind introduction. I have a lot of weedy PowerPoints here, but I'm going to whiz through them fairly quickly within hopefully 10 minutes, and so leave plenty of time for discussion. I assume these will be posted on the website later, and so I would encourage you, if you really want to get down on the weeds in this, to review those. The outline, and don't be scared by this, is basically, if we walk through the history, you have to start with the convention, the run-up to convention. The second major milestone, I would say, was the Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed to without the United States in Kyoto, Japan in 1997. And then we had a series of meetings after that, which really were at trying to get the United States back into the game, since the United States refused to take on the targets and timetables mandated by Kyoto. And so we've had a series of meetings since then, Bali, Poznan, Poland, Copenhagen, Durban, South Africa, Doha, Qatar, back in Warsaw, Poland, and then last December in Lima, Peru. And now, of course, we have the Paris conference coming up, which is supposed to be, of course, the end game here, which hopefully will be, from the proponents of that, the final, but it really won't be the final negotiating act in this long series of exercises which have been going on for almost 25 years. We might ask, what has this accomplished? And what are the players, the major players in this saying? And then what are the major issues? And then I'll try to give my thoughts on what are the likely outcomes. Senator Lee did give you, I think, a good overview of what the Framework Convention does. It was approved in May of 1992, entered into force in 1994. It is a universal treaty. All the members of the United Nations, plus a couple of countries which aren't members of the United Nations, have actually signed on, plus the European Union, the 28 members of the current European Union. We have the ultimate objective of the convention, which Senator Lee referred to. And I'm going to say that what I believe the difficulty is, and what's really hamstrung progress and will continue to hamstrung progress, were certain compromises that were made when the climate change convention was negotiated in 1992. And this begins with what I would call dividing the world into three groups. You have a group of Annex 1 parties, which are considered developed country parties. And you have then a set of Annex 2 parties who have to pay for everything. And then you have the non-Annex 1 parties, which have some, 153 others left over. Now, the convention itself set up non-binding greenhouse gas emissions targets and timetables for both developed and developing countries. But there was words in there to the effect that Annex 1 parties, the developed country parties, should take the lead. And then you have this very troubling and repeated issue of according to principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, sometimes in the parlance known as C, B, D, R, RC. You will often see that in the parlance. And then we have the phrase that the extent to which developing country parties will effectively implement their commitments under the convention will depend upon developed country parties effectively implementing their commitments, which includes provision of financing, technology, et cetera. Again, we have the famous, again, caveat, recognizing that it takes the developing countries at a lesser level in terms of their efforts. Now, here's basically the group, the larger group of countries. The outside box there are the Annex 1 parties who had special obligations to take the lead, but then you get down to Annex 2, and these are the payers. And there were these three compromises, again, that were necessary to get everybody on board, which made seem like a good idea then, but it continues to stymie, in my opinion, stymie the process. So you have then, just reading down, then you have, this issue about developed countries taking the lead, and then you have this subset of the 24 which have to pay. So they not only get the enjoyment of paying for everything they're going to do to reduce their emissions and adapt to climate change, but also the what can I say, the great honor of paying the developing world for what they're going to do, or they don't have to do anything. It's quite a deal, isn't it? So that therein, I think, lies the dilemma, and this is the issue which has dogged negotiations since that time, and I believe will continue to dog the negotiations. The Kyoto Protocol, if you read Steve Munson's piece in the Washington Post today, he said, it was all the terrible things really happened in Kyoto. That's what really separated developed and developing countries and set up this firewall. My answer to that is no, it's really the convention. And the Kyoto was just an elaboration of what I consider to be a flawed groundwork for, again, negotiating further on climate change. There are a whole bunch of paths forward. I'm going to just skip through these. I mentioned, I'll let you read if you're interested, read the PowerPoints, moving forward through some 8 years plus of negotiations with minimal, I would say, minimal progress, if indeed you believe that progress was important. And so we now have what was agreed to in Lima, the idea of countries coming forward with their INDCs, their intended national determined contributions that they're going to bring forward. And some 155 countries have done that. And so, and it's covering most of the world's population and most of the emissions. And so, again, reference, I believe that Senator Lee made, these negotiations have been underway, the serious ones, pre-Paris negotiations, have really been underway just this year, although there were a number of meetings before then. And so out of that, we have a series of meetings where they start with a huge text. They started with 90 pages in Geneva, and they agreed to in February to form a basis negotiation. They come in, they keep meeting, they whittle down, it expands like an accordion. So this is ratcheting up with the latest text that's going into to Paris to be negotiated at some 51 pages. Now, what has all this accomplished, you might ask, in terms of emissions reduction? And I did these figures, by the way, based upon statistics, which the New York Times told us today are probably wrong. But given the difficulty with China's data set on carbon dioxide emissions, what we've seen, whether you look at just greenhouse gas emissions, which include sinks and all of the different gases other than carbon dioxide, or look at carbon dioxide emissions just from fuel combustion, which is much of the focus. So world emissions are up. Most of the developed countries' emissions are flat or decreased, and then you see the developing world's emissions going up and continuing to go up. 87% if you're looking at overall greenhouse, nearly 2/3 if you're just looking at the CO2. Again, it's important, I think, if you're analyzing what might be going to happen, to look at what statements that different delegations have made. And there have been a whole series, of course, of agreements between the United States and China. China alone sent in a fairly long explanation of what they hope to get out of Paris, along with their INDC submission at the end of June. And then just a couple of days ago, you had a France-China agreement. So I'll leave that to you, but if you look at through all of this, the bottom line, what are the major issues? It's the same issues which have confronted the negotiators for nearly 25 years, and I believe will continue to be a difficulty. And the first of all, of course, is the differentiation issue. First, I should say, I think the main issue will be on financing. That's going to be, I think, the major issue. How are we going to deliver on this $100 billion that was promised, first in Copenhagen and then further promised in subsequent meetings in Cancun and other fora? Developing countries are expecting that. Of course, they'll want it to be, most of it run through the Green Climate Fund. This $100 billion annually, of course, was to come from a variety of sources, public and private. Developing countries, of course, saying, oh, no, it all has to be public money. It all has to go through a Green Climate Fund, which, by the way, is monitored by the Conference of Parties, not by the World Bank and the Global Environment Facility, as are the other funds. Loss and damage is an issue which has popped up in the last several years. That brings the whole issue of reparations to developed countries. Obviously, have caused the problem is the argument. You caused all these historic emissions. We're suffering damage now. Every storm, every hurricane, et cetera, although they haven't blamed earthquakes yet, but that's always a possibility, has been caused by developed country emissions. Therefore, you owe us for that. And that's also something that the folks are in developing countries are looking to get compensated for. And then also the technology transfer issue, which is always there. You have a number of developing country parties that would love to have free technology, aren't particularly concerned about intellectual property rights. And so that's always going to be. Then, of course, the differentiation issue, which is going to be there. The legal form, top-down, bottom-up versus the hybrid issue, although I think, certainly concur, we're looking to so-called hybrid approach. The issue of transparencies. How are you going to be able to trust what countries say they're going to do? They're really going to be able to measure it. You have to question the ability of developing countries in particular to do that. And then what are those reporting cycles? 5 years, et cetera, et cetera. Developing countries are also very concerned about the balance between adaptation and mitigation. They consider that mitigation has been emphasized too much in these talks, and that adaptation ought to take a more meaningful role. And then the issue of what should be the long-term goal. 2 degrees seems to be the 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, warming above pre-industrial time seems to be what they focus on. Is that doable? Who knows? So just to end with my view of what likely outcomes are, an agreement will be reached. The French have already budgeted something over $200 million for this conference, put a lot of intellectual and capital into this, as well as international prestige. They're going to do everything they can to get an agreement. I think the seriousness of what they're doing, I was inviting the leaders actually the first day of the conference to prevent what happened in Copenhagen, where you had the leaders coming in the last 2 or 3 days, and then the whole thing blew up. I think it's going to be a 5-year interval, requirement of review, and I think that we'll have the effect that's going in there of this review process. They're going to say that you have to come in with deeper cuts every time you resubmit your INDC. And so what it's going to have the impact is to pressuring developed countries to take deeper cuts, say on a regular basis, say every 5 years. And by the way, you have to pony up more money and more technology. Non-legally binding language on finance, but some sort of a SOP on the $100 billion. Again, I think there's going to be reference to this long-term goal, meaningless. I think there's also going to be a call for elimination, which has been popular in particular in the G20 circles, of calling for the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. Hopefully someday somebody will say elimination of all subsidies, which I think is a more rational approach. It's going to be more, I think, emphasis on adaptation and mitigation, and then this law, this so-called loss and damage issue, which was particularly elaborated a bit in Warsaw a couple of years ago. I think will be referenced, but they're going to put it aside and say, well, we need to do more work on it. So this will not be the end of the COPs. Just note at ending that the rules of engagement on the Kyoto Protocol took 8 years to develop, and it'll take, I think, at least that long to get the rules of the road set on what does it mean to measure, monitor, and verify, what are you going to report, et cetera, who's going to do the accounting. So we're looking at a long negotiation road ahead on this process. So if you're going to be a climate negotiator, you have job security for a long time. With that, I'll stop. Thanks,
Harlan. Let me introduce Christopher Horner to you. And just, if you look at that last slide, this isn't, this number really is unbelievable. It's $100 billion a year beginning in 2020. And Senator Lee was talking about, you know, the purse strings are controlled by Congress. That's not like a one-time thing. That's every year, beginning in the year 2020, $100 billion.
Presumably escalating over time.
And then going up. So 2021, $100 billion. 2022, $100 billion. And it's the United States, it's you, our taxpayers, who are going to be considered to be ponying up probably about 35% of that. So it's going to be
31.4, I think, the latest.
So 31.4 billion.
21.4.
21?
Yeah.
Oh, I think it's going to be higher than that. We pay less. We pay more than that in UN dues.
We got to get a better deal on this, I think.
Okay. Let's say a bunch of money, better should be spent here in the United States. Yeah. Instead, we'll be going to finance green climate projects in Madagascar. Let me introduce Chris Horner, who will put some more detail on what to expect. He is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. An attorney by trade, Chris represents CEI as well as scientists and members of Congress on matters of environmental policy in the federal courts and in the Supreme Court. He has testified before the Senate Committees on Foreign Relations and Environment and Public Works, and works on a legal and policy level with numerous think tanks and policy organizations like the Heritage Foundation and others around the world. Chris received his law degree from Washington University in St. Louis. So, Chris, thank you. And please tell us your remarks.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And following up on Dr. Watson's comments, I stopped going to these a few years ago. They became quite ritual. They would end the day after they were scheduled to end with the tears in the eyes in the morning, waving around a historic agreement to meet again next year. And this cannot be that. Obviously, this is their last chance. So I don't see it blowing up. I think the French, acting out of an abundance of caution, are bringing in the world leaders beforehand. But I just don't know how this one blows up, because they're going to, well, they don't have a difficult negotiating partner in the U.S. You see the president boasting, for example, in the Rolling Stone interview about the 5-year auto-renew and escalator clause. So this isn't something we were dragged into to get to Paris. There's something, they're in on this. Following my takeaway from the senator's comments is that the issue is less one of a White House whose long suit has always been denigration, denigrating the Senate's role in the treaty process. That's now a given. The issue is, will the Senate sit idly by? And it seems quaint to appeal to the institutionalists, of course, Byrd Hagel included Mr. Byrd, but at minimum appeal to the self-interest of those lawmakers who want to block EPA's or overturn, undo EPA's greenhouse gas rules. It's going to be much less politically difficult if you express the sense of the Senate in advance of Paris that this is in agreement with the president, just words. So, 3 points. The administration's objective for Paris is to politically insulate these rules, not obtain a document that claims to be legally binding, of course. Declaring that a treaty is not a treaty is absurd. There's no indication the executive has the only voice on this. The response is for the Senate to exercise its role and treat the document like Paris's predecessor treaties. Focusing on the legal form of Paris is a distraction, almost fighting the last war. Just treat it like it is. Therefore, necessary steps to stop an end run, the conclusion of a series of circumventing the proper democratic process, go beyond not funding the GCF and Congressional Review Act, disapproval of the rules, but a sense, the facts, the history, the obvious intentions behind Paris, the content, demand a sense of the Senate resolution asserting 3 historical facts and resolving that in agreement with the president. Paris is just words. Doing so in advance, again, will make undoing EPA's rules that much less politically difficult. So first, my read is that the Obama administration's objective is it goes beyond changing the discussion, the legacy discussion on foreign policy from Iran to climate. It goes toward protecting and insulating EPA's rules politically. What Hillary Clinton described as something that, quote, must be protected at all costs, you're seeing one of the costs. Quote, the unprecedented action that President Obama has taken must be protected at all costs. Paris seeks to do so by sealing the rules in political amber, trying to politically corner the next administration, Congress, and even pressure the courts. The argument, after all of this, Paris, no big deal here, nothing to see, avert thy gaze, Senate. The moment this concludes in December, the moment COP21 concludes, the argument will be that EPA's rules cannot be upset. They're part of something larger. We promised them to the world. So the drama that's intended and the difficult position that this intends to put his country in can largely, if not completely, be avoided by the Senate speaking in advance, making clear that there can be no claim post-Paris to have reasonably considered the commitments there by the president as anything more than executive freelancing, absent ratification. That is merely what Professor Jeremy Rabkin, who I saw in the hallway a little earlier, calls the equivalent of a State of the Union address to foreigners. Promises he hopes Congress will act on, but nothing more. That ratification is required, no matter who says this isn't a treaty because I say it isn't, is made plain by Paris's contents and lineage, the level of detail, the level of commitment. It's on its face a treaty more so than the treaty it extends, the Framework Convention, and for many of the same reasons that the treaty it replaces, Kyoto, was a treaty. The president's claim that it is not a treaty is simply because this same deal failed last time around when they admitted it was a treaty. Our treaty process ensures the U.S. will not become party to any such deal, so the administration's answer is that the treaty process has to be abandoned. He's not alone, of course. Further explaining this move and consistent with Secretary Clinton's counsel of protecting these EPA rules at all cost, France's Foreign Minister Fabius openly boasts that, quote, "We know the politics in the U.S., whether we like it or not. If it comes to the Congress, they will refuse. So keep it away from Congress," is his counsel. Except that it's got to be something that doesn't go before Congress. That's not the negotiating partner's decision. But the foreign minister uses the word politics here as code for our treaty process, which to those inconvenienced by such process, as we have seen, is mere politics, an impediment to be circumvented. The foreign minister's advice to diplomatic counterparts is to just accept that Paris does not proclaim, quote, legally binding targets and timetables, which, as Senator Lee pointed out, is an invented standard. You can't point to its genesis. The more recent lineage affirms this. We know about the 2011 promise in Durban that Paris would be, quote, "a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force," close quote. Then the administration and others realized that this bravado cannot be consummated. They wrote rhetorical checks that their politics can't cash. More instructive, their insistence now that Paris is not a treaty is an assurance that Durban no longer means anything. Just one of several examples of how promises in this context are easily broken by proponents of an agreement in order to get past the moment and get their way. It's a cautionary tale as to the way this enterprise has proceeded and will proceed in the future. One vow that we would be told we cannot abandon, of course, is the most critical distinction between Kyoto and Paris. Kyoto expressed one 5-year compliance period. Paris promises a new and updated emission reduction promise, or INDC, every 5 years. Each is to be, quote, progressive beyond prior commitments, tighter, more stringent. Article 3. The idea is to never have to go through this process, meaning never having to risk Senate advice and consent again. That this is a big deal, again, note that the president has twice specifically invoked it, once in his Rolling Stone interview and once in the announcement with China. The administration is not dragged into this. They're completely in on this move. It's worth noting in deciding whether or not the Senate should express its advice that this renewal and escalator clause concludes a process whose hallmark has been circumventing the proper democratic process. The agenda began as legislation, passed the House, then was killed by the Harry Reid-controlled Senate. The EPA, the administration, then went around the democratic process to impose rules achieving the same objective. Now, as they see the extreme political and legal jeopardy those rules are in, vulnerabilities, they seek to insulate them, to challenge it with a global promise intended to pressure President Obama's successor, Congress, and even the courts, and we've seen this, to leave this end run unmolested on a matter the public and their elected representatives have rejected at every turn through the proper democratic process. At least as important as this point, this walks away from the politically binding deal struck when the, again, Democrat-controlled Senate agreed to ratify the Framework Convention, to the effect that, quote, "The Committee on Foreign Relations notes that a decision by the Conference of the Parties to adopt targets and timetables would have to be submitted to the Senate for its advice and consent." Very clear. Executive Report 102-55, page 14. Therefore, in addition to not underwriting the GCF and Congressional Review Act disapproval, you have to agree with the President and a sense of the Senate. Paris is just words. Reaffirming with a majority vote that the deal the Senate struck in 1992 still holds. This only requires 3 factual assertions and a resolved clause. First, assert the agreed fact that COP21 cannot be disputed. You may not like it, may still vote against it, but you can't rationally argue against it. The agreed fact that the COP21 in Paris is meeting for purposes including to fulfill the Durban platform. The vow to, quote, to develop a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the Framework Convention. Next, note that the Senate ratified the convention on October 7th, 92, on the basis of a deal asserted by the Committee on Foreign Relations. Finally, note that this 1992 deal, as set forth in the committee's report, still holds. If that deal doesn't hold, you need this resolution even more, because it would affirm once again that we're dealing in an area where agreements made today mean nothing tomorrow when those deals stand in the way of an agenda. Simply resolve then that these whereas facts are the record which led to Paris, that any decision pursuant to the Durban platform, which Paris inarguably is, or any decision by the Conference of the Parties meeting in Paris to adopt targets and timetables, which Paris also is, notwithstanding these games we've heard about claiming, well, we're going to have each country post its own number on a separate website, so you see it's not in the document. That doesn't get you around the fact that Paris is represent a decision by the conference of the parties to adopt targets and timetables. And then you say this has to be submitted to the Senate for its advice and consent before the U.S. could accede to the agreement. In that event, there can be no claim after Paris that this in any way whatsoever insulates EPA's rules from meeting their proper fate through the democratic process that seems to be the kryptonite for this mischief. In short, ask not what the Senate can do to stop the executive from going to Paris and rhetorically writing checks. Ask what the executive can do to stop the Senate from reasserting its proper role in the treaty process, the shared treaty process. The answer to both is nothing. The tie goes to he who seeks to create the necessary ambiguity, ensuring that no party can reasonably claim we relied upon your promises as if they bound you. That is, to ensure that these promises in Paris are no more than what Professor Radkin calls the State of the Union to foreigners. So, this in turn removes the we promised them to the world claim, which is the ultimate objective of Paris. You can't touch these rules. They're sacrosanct. They're bigger now. That we promised them to the world, and they reasonably relied on that promise, which will surely prove to be the biggest and most shrilly enunciated impediment to disapproving or otherwise overturning the rules after Paris. The Senate already risks ceding its proper constitutional treaty role in the wake of the Iran debacle. Given what we know and what we have very good reason to suspect about the intentions for Paris, as well as Paris's own terms, its lineage, its level of detail and commitment, the Senate's only responsible move is to reassert its role here before Paris. Advice is a dish best served in advance. As a rule, things are much less difficult to block than to undo, be it a telephone tax to fund the Spanish-American War, the Interstate Commerce Commission, promises made in Paris, or EPA's rules. If only out of their own individual and collective self-interest, congressional opponents of EPA's rules, who may have little interest in treaty matters, should at minimum recognize that undoing EPA's rules would be a far sight, less politically difficult, if they assert their sense of the Senate on Paris in advance. That would take away the planned talking point that these rules were promised to the world, which had a reasonable basis to believe that President Obama was in any way committing us. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. It seems from what you're saying that this administration, usually when you have an event and you go and you do lessons learned from it, it's lessons learned in order to improve the process, lessons learned to do it better the next time. But all the lessons that this administration has learned are ways to go and do this through a back deal, go and do this without democratic participation, with us not joining Kyoto, the collapse in Copenhagen. The lesson learned is, well, don't write it in such a way that the Senate is going to have a review on it. Also, since instead of doing new committal periods, which require new negotiating, they're just going to re-up it every 5 years at their conference, whether it's in Bali or Paris or Geneva or wherever they'll have it next time. So it's really disheartening to hear that the lessons learned from these failures is how to make it even less democratic and more burdensome. I'd like to introduce our final panelist, my colleague Nick Loris. He's an economist here at Heritage who focuses on energy, environmental, and regulatory issues. And he's going to bring home some of the things that we're hearing about what this impact might be here in the United States. Because he researches and writes about energy supplies, energy prices, and other economic effects of environmental policies and regulations, including climate change legislation. He covers coal, oil, natural gas, and renewable energy policy, and articulates the benefits of free market environmentalism. He has a bachelor's degree in economics, finance, and political science from Albrecht College, and a master's in economics from George Mason University. Thank you, Nick, and please tell us your comments.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. And thank you all for being here. I'd like to begin by discussing what we've got and what people from around the world have got from participation in the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the reality is, and the short of it is, it's been a lot of junk. The policies, both domestically and internationally, supporting climate efforts have resulted in higher energy prices, wasted taxpayer dollars, and distorted energy markets that reward political connectedness over market viability. And we've been on a kick to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for decades, really. And through the federal government, through state governments. We've implemented a number of policies through legislation, through regulation, executive orders, all with the specific stated goal of reducing greenhouse gas regulations and weaning Americans off oil and fossil fuels. We have targeted tax credits for renewables, grants, loans, and loan guarantees that support carbon-free sources of energy. We have a renewable fuel standard that mandates the use of ethanol and other biofuels, energy efficiency mandates for appliances and vehicles, applied research funding at the Department of Energy that specifically goes towards the commercialization of carbon-free energy technologies. We have renewable electricity standards that mandate a state generates a certain percentage of its electricity from renewables by certain dates. We have renewable requirements in our military, and the list goes on and on. The Obama administration really put this on steroids. First with the stimulus spending, where he put tens of billions of dollars into green energy projects, but even with smaller decisions like the Keystone XL pipeline, where back in 2013 he said that climate change would be the determining factor of whether he would approve or reject this pipeline. And even though his own State Department said that this pipeline wouldn't contribute significantly to climate change because the oil in Canada is going to come out of the ground anyway, here we are 7 years later without a pipeline. And the meat of what President Obama will parade around Paris with is the regulations of new and existing power plants. It's effectively backdoor cap and trade legislation. By effectively prohibiting the construction of new coal-fired power plants, by setting the CO2 per megawatt hour so low that these new power plants will require carbon capture and sequestration technology that is prohibitively expensive and a NIMBY nightmare. And then the Clean Power Plan that will require 47 states to drastically cut their CO2 emissions and shift America's energy economy away from affordable, reliable sources and to those politically preferred ones. Now, all these policies aren't to reduce pollution. It's not to protect air quality or water quality, but predicated on the notion that we need to do something about climate change, not that these policies would have any impact anyway. And here's the problem with that. 80% of America's energy needs are met through carbon-emitting fossil fuels. In fact, 80% of the world's needs are met through carbon-emitting fossil fuels. And this isn't because of any government plan or centrally controlled energy agenda. It's because these are the energy sources that provide us with reliable electricity, with reliable transportation fuels at competitive prices. Thus, this effort, both domestically and internationally, to decarbonize the energy economy by driving up the cost of fossil fuels, oil, coal, and even natural gas, so we use less, has significant adverse effects on wealth and prosperity. We feel the effects not just when we pay our utility bills and at the gas station, but also indirectly through all the goods and services we pay for. Companies will pass these higher costs on to consumers. If companies are fortunate enough to absorb these costs, that allocates money away from hiring and new investment and towards those higher energy bills. So the cumulative result is fewer opportunities, trillions of dollars lost in GDP, and just broadly less economic growth. And it's America's energy-intensive manufacturing base and the low-income families who spend a disproportionately higher percentage of their budget on energy that are going to be hardest hit. But the economic damage of these policies extends beyond the lost taxpayer dollars and beyond the higher energy prices, because these policies, whether it's regulations, subsidies, government-backed finance programs, fundamentally skew the rules of the game and the rules of free enterprise. Because you have investment opportunities are abound in energy. The need to turn our lights on and off and to get our vehicles from point A to point B isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But the capital to finance these projects is not limited. And when you have a government stamp of approval, or if you have the taxpayer funding a portion of the project, that dedicates private money towards those projects and away from potentially more innovative, more promising endeavors. You can look at Solyndra, for instance. Private investors sunk $1.1 billion into Solyndra, but most of that money came after the Department of Energy announced that it was going to be one of the 16 companies eligible for a loan guarantee. And that's $1.1 billion that can't be spent elsewhere. And this is what's happening all over the world, not just in the United States, but really with all these export credit programs, with Ex-Im Bank. This is how it distorts the market and shifts financing from, again, things that are rewarded based on political profit rather than economic profit. Now, the Obama administration will want you to believe that the private sector is supporting his efforts in Paris. He said, I think it was last week, that this agreement in Paris isn't just for tree huggers and hippies, but corporate America has got his back too, and pointed to the fact that Walmart, Google, and Apple, and a number of other big corporate companies have signed on and are lining up to support his international agreement to cap and cut greenhouse gas emissions. And you don't really have to peel back the layers to really see what these companies are getting at. If an international agreement somehow forces other countries to make cuts, businesses will see that as leveling the playing field, even though that just means higher costs for the rest of us. They'll also claim that an international climate agreement will provide them with certainty, even though the way these agreements are structured, as my colleagues have mentioned, that's far from the case. And the best certainty is really to get rid of all of these policies and programs in the first place. And they can be crafted in a way that protects big businesses. These are the companies that will have a seat at the table rather than be left out in the cold. And these are the companies that can absorb the costs of higher energy prices and burdensome regulations more easily than smaller businesses, so it squeezes out the competition. All that is to say that no matter how these deals are ultimately crafted and no matter which policies are implemented, we're the ones that are going to pay for them. And to really rub salt in the wound, these regulations will amount to global temperature reductions that is almost too small to measure. This is far from a problem in just the United States. Many countries in Europe have already gone down this road, and Chris gives a great presentation on this of why Western Europe provides Exhibit A through Z of what not to do when it comes to energy policy. The subsidies and regulations to reduce CO2 emissions have created energy poverty in areas where turning on lights was a foregone conclusion. And perhaps worst of all and most frustrating is it traps the world's poorest citizens from obtaining a better standard of living. And I think one of the biggest hoodwinks that the UN and proponents of action on climate change try to pull is this use of the precautionary principle when it comes to addressing climate change. They take this better safe than sorry approach. So even if we're not headed towards catastrophic warming, it's better to do something just in case. And you can look at the principles of the 1992 convention, and it says this, and I quote, "Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing such measures, taking into account that policies and measures to deal with climate change should be cost-effective so as to ensure global benefits at the lowest possible costs." And when you hear those words, it sounds as if the policies they're implementing are pretty painless. It's as simple as looking both ways before you cross the street. But the cost of doing a left, right, left before you cross the street is pretty painless. When it comes to climate change and the use of the precautionary principle, they ignore the costs, the risks, and the unintended consequences with decarbonizing the world and the energy economy, which I just outlined. All of these activities that drastically improve our lives require energy, and it's carbon-based energy. There are huge, huge costs to restricting energy production and preventing the poorest citizens from obtaining accessible, reliable baseload energy. And to give a quick example, when Hurricane Katrina ravaged the Gulf Coast in 2005, we had 2.6 million people in America without reliable electricity, without power. And we remember seeing the TV reports and remember how terrible and awful that was. If you multiply that number, that 2.6 million, by 500, that's how many people are in the world without access to modern electricity every single day. 1.3 billion people. You have more than 2.5 billion people who use animal waste, leaves, wood, and charcoal to cook their food and heat their homes, which we know creates real adverse environmental and health effects. So energy poverty is a real imminent threat, which the precautionary principle just casts aside. And if there's a moral imperative that should be discussed in Paris, it's getting these people a better standard of living and access to energy, not erecting more barriers to do so with nonsensical climate initiatives. And I think what's most important to stress is that it's economic growth that will protect these people from extreme weather events and climate change, whether it's created by man-made emissions or not. The latest heat wave in India, I think, is a great example where it tragically claimed more than 2,500 lives. And proponents of greenhouse gas reductions and climate initiatives will say that we're only going to experience more of those. The heat waves are going to be longer. They're going to be more intense. So we need to do something about it. But it's access to reliable electricity and air conditioning that can prevent people from heat waves. It can prevent people from cold spells. It's why wealthier countries are quicker to protect and quicker to recover from earthquakes than poorer countries. It's a standard of living that we take for granted that a lot of people are still trying to obtain. And so the risks associated with poverty and the importance of energy, specifically coal, oil, and natural gas, of alleviating those risks are much more clear, imminent, and solvable than the risks associated with carbon-emitting energy sources and their impact on global warming. For that, I think we need to get rid of, or the United States at least needs to get out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change altogether. I think that should be a priority for the next administration, not just for members of Congress and policymakers to make their voice heard when it comes to Paris, but really for candidates to say this is an unworkable group effort that is produced nothing but economic catastrophe and done little to do anything about climate change, whether we're headed towards catastrophic warming or not. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. It just strikes me that when you hear about the actual real-world effects that these policies will have, probably not as much on you or me or a lot of the people in this room, but the poorest and least protected people around the world. It just goes to show the folly of the nature of progressivism, to think that you can go and get 196 countries in Paris and come up with solutions that are actually going to help the little people. It's just this the whole nature of their thought process on this. With an eye towards wrapping up our event at 4 o'clock, what I'd like to do is go directly to questions from the audience. So we have about 10 minutes to play with. If there are none, I'll be happy to do questions as a moderator. There's a question in the back. Please, when you wait, please wait for the microphone so that our viewers at home can hear you. A gentleman in the back.
Yeah, hi, Bill Murray from Real Clear Energy. And this might be a question to the last speaker, but how does one go about pulling one's name off of a treaty that's been passed already by 2/3 of the Senate 25 years ago? Where does one start to debate that?
Well, I think it ultimately starts with the next administration, who hopefully admits that this has been unworkable. And I think, I don't know the necessary steps that need to be taken, but whether it's through Congress or whether it's through the executive branch, I see no problem with it being done either way.
It's in Revelations in the back of the Framework Convention. It's Article 25, 26. Somewhere in the back, they set forth the process for withdrawing.
It's generally a year. You send in your notice very much like Canada did when they withdrew from Kyoto. You send them a letter saying we're withdrawing, very simple, to the UN, and a year from that date of the receipt of that letter, why you're no longer in.
Presidents have withdrawn from controversial agreements in the past, like when the Bush administration withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and I think when we withdrew from the Panama Canal Treaty. It happens. It's not common, but if there's one convention that's worthy of being withdrawn from, I think it's this UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, because it's on the basis of those provisions that the current administration is saying, well, that's why we have the authority to negotiate what we're going to do in Paris and not bring it back to the Senate. It's because we already have a treaty, the one that we agreed to in 1992. So it can be a source of mischief, and so why not just remove the U.S. From this debacle, 21 meetings in 23 years that Senator Lee referred to.
That's why that language is in there.
Mm-hmm. There's a gentleman in the back over here, Connor. Oh, I didn't see you.
I'm John Quapis. I'm the former executive director of the Center for Peace and Freedom, which used to be headquartered on the 5th floor of this building. As we look at the treaty proposals and critique them, aside from the fundamental, obvious, basic issue of the flawed premise that underlies the whole scheme and treaty, there's another element that I think is somewhat ignored, and that is the reality that this proposal, this treaty, would very fundamentally undermine the sovereignty of the United States. Jacques Chirac, former president of France, explicitly talked about this, I think it was 2004, 2005, when he said that the climate change treaty would be a major, major step forward in the global governance of the world, i.e. through the United Nations. And this treaty would, in effect, macro-manage a large portion of the world's economies, and would require so many different things in each country. It would put us under the UN courts as well, et cetera, et cetera. There's so much involved in the details, the devil is in the details, that fundamentally restricts and reduces our sovereignty as a nation. And I think that's a factor as well. Of course, the primary issue being the flawed premise and the costs that are involved in this thing.
So a question about sovereignty.
Every international agreement, every treaty involves the parties ceding some measure of sovereignty. That's a given. That's part of the process. I was in the room when Mr. Chirac gave that plenary address in The Hague. It was November, December of 2000. And I was there, and I sent a piece in to UPI, and the editor was, to put it mildly, furious, saying you can't just make things up, nobody would ever say that. She didn't run the piece. He said this is the first component of an authentic global governance. Global governance is a term used in the business. Global governance doesn't mean a global government, but as Jim Sensenbrenner said outside in the hallway, only to be sworn at by the Guardian reporter who was circling around him yelling, bollocks, bollocks. Congressman Sensenbrenner said, if you want to do anything to diminish the chances of the U.S. participation, keep giving speeches saying this is the first component of an authentic global governance. You could spot the Americans in the room when he said that by who did and who did not drop their jaw. But remember, every treaty does involve every party cedes some measure of sovereignty through an agreement. It's not my opinion that that's the principal objective of this. I mean, if they could get the wealth transfer and what Ottmar Edenhofer calls, look, climate policy has nothing to do with the environment. Climate policy is about redistributing the world's wealth de facto. If they could get that done without any, exchange of sovereignty, then I'm sure they'd be willing to. I don't think that the diminution of our sovereignty is the principal objective here. But there's certainly an element of it in every agreement.
It does fit in well with Obama's idea of fundamentally transform the U.S. And by the way, that statement by Chirac I have on video. I mean, it's available on video.
Actually, the court has been put back in.
Yeah, the International Climate Justice Tribunal is in the draft. This is the draft that someone was referring to, this 55-page monster, and it currently contains an International Climate Justice Tribunal, which sounds as
That's a footnote to that comment about, now, they will drop that out. I think it's been in every draft every year. Yeah. It's there, in my opinion, again, with some more loss and damage provisions as leverage, because in the name of certainty, why you'd prefer to fund the GCF than have this, wouldn't you? I say keep the tribunal in there. I can't think of anything that would better focus people's attention on this. But that would certainly change the sovereignty calculus.
And remember, at least back in the day, the executive branch would go negotiate a treaty, and then they'd bring it back to the Senate, where these issues about sovereignty, self-governance, and implementing legislation and U.S. commitments would be had, and you'd need a supermajority of the Senate to make it so. And so if you were going to cede some element of sovereignty, at least there was some democratic legitimacy behind it, because the Senate had a crack at it. What's going to happen in Paris is going to completely bypass the Senate. So even the modicum of help that congressional review would have to fuse potential sovereignty issues won't be available this time around. I saw a question over on this side. Yes.
Yeah, Steve Allen, Greenwatch and Capital Research Center. With regard to the precautionary principle, when I'm talking to my lefty friends, I point out, I give an illustration of the precautionary principle, which is if Saddam Hussein might have weapons of mass destruction, we must invade his country because that's what the precautionary principle says we must do. Let me ask about the Global Climate Fund. How will this money be distributed among the kleptocrats, mobsters, con men, dictators who will be getting this money? What will they do with it?
I hate people who answer their own questions.
Genocide. You've got genocideers, so they're out there too.
Yeah, they have This facility is housed in Seoul, Korea, or at least in a suburb of Seoul. They've set up a board of directors. Half of them have to be, this governing board, half from developed countries, half from the donors, and the other half from the donees. They are trying to put into place, accounting rules and so on. They're trying to replicate, I think, very much the World Bank system, so that there'll be some modicum anyway of accountability for the funds. I believe right now, I can't remember how many projects are in line, but there are a number of projects in line getting funding. There is a few $1 billion in there. $10.2 billion, I think, is the latest figure. It has been pledged. That includes $3 billion from the Obama administration over 4 years. Well, a lot of the money is still in the pledging stage. So it will move forward. I don't know if they're going to have time to actually do an award in time for Paris or not. That would probably not beyond the realm of possibility, and to have a big event on that.
So, ladies and gentlemen, mark your calendars. November 30 to December 11th is the Paris Climate Change Conference. As has been mentioned, the President and other world leaders will parachute in at the beginning of the conference rather than be present for the collapse that happened in Copenhagen. Although, as Chris rightly points out, I think this cake is baked already, so don't expect a collapse in Paris. Expect an agreement along the lines that Senator Lee discussed and our panelists have discussed. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming and attending today. I'm sorry if the room was a little bit warm in the beginning. I don't know if it was just me, but it seemed like a little bit warm in the beginning. I think it looked like it got the AC going. But I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists for coming and talking with us today. And thank you all very much for coming again. Thank you.